Hello, friends of Studio Brûlé. This is Steve Brûlé, and it is coffee time. Going over a few things that have come across my desk since yesterday, last coffee time. So today, the title of the session is Critical Racist Theology. And I chose that title because I think some of the things that I ran into this morning and last night, are heavily influenced by this bigoted, hate-filled ideology. So it does, obviously I'm referring to critical race theory, and I think it fits more in the category of theology than theory, and it's not race theology, it's racist theology, because it is always constantly blaming white people for every problem in North America and in the world in general. So I'm not going to go into detail on that particular theory because it could take up a session or more, and lots of times to detail out how it negatively influences a lot of our culture and the education system, including boys in grade school and high school and university. And that's not even a start to the topic of how this insidious, hate-filled, racist theory has adversely affected our culture. So I've only got a few slides on it because I want to get to a couple of the significant articles in the news that I think are the events that they described are heavily influenced by this particular racist theology. So let's have a look at the terms itself. Critical race theory, or as I'm preferring to call it, critical racist theology. Let's read what it says here from Wikipedia. Critical race theory is an academic movement made up of civil rights scholars and activists in the United States who seek to critically examine the law as it intersects with the issues of race and to challenge mainstream liberal approaches to racial justice. CRT examines social and cultural issues as they relate to race, law, and social and political power. Okay, fine. That's the kind of boilerplate description of what they claim to be trying to get at. CRT, reading from the top with me. CRT originated in the mid-1970s in the writings of several American legal scholars, including Derek Bell, Alan Freeman, Kimberly Crenshaw, and you can read the other names here if you like. CRT emerged as a movement by the 1980s, reworking theories of critical legal studies with more focus on race. As the word critical suggests, both theoretical frameworks are rooted in critical theory, a social philosophy which argues that social problems are influenced and created more by societal structures and cultural assumptions than by individual and psychological factors. Now, that society, that our culture influences people, I don't think anybody doubts that. The difference here is that these people, in the practical application of their critical race theory, attribute everything to that and give a free pass to everybody in society who they consider to protect, or the minorities and visible minorities, generally speaking, a free pass on being innocent of all of their responsibility for their own lives completely. So this is where the distortion really comes in, because clearly culture does influence people, but people clearly have responsibility for their own behavior. And in the absence of responsibility for your own behavior, we have absolute chaos and an unrooted society. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but let's carry on with the slides here today. CRT is loosely unified by two common themes. First, that white supremacy exists and maintains power through law. Second, that transforming the relationship between law and racial power, as well as achieving racial emancipation and anti-subordination more broadly, are possible. Right away you can see they're getting off track. First, they make the assumption that white supremacy exists. There may be I won't argue against this, that there may be some people who are white supremacists out there. That does not equate to, which they're implying here, that white supremacy exists as a major force in our culture. It does not. They claim that this is a pillar of the influences in our society, that this is a major player in how our culture plays out in terms of political, social power. Second, let's read on, that transforming the relationship between law and racial power, as well as achieving racial emancipation and anti-subordination more broadly, are possible. Of course they are possible, but in coding law, making law distinctly different based on race is racism. And this is what they ultimately do. They are changing law such that people of a different race are treated differently under the law. That is a fundamental error that can only lead to discrimination and racism. So, let's carry on. Critics of CRT say that it relies on social constructionism. Well, of course, it does rely on social constructionism. The critics are absolutely right. Elevates storytelling over evidence and reason, rejects the concept of truth and merit, and opposes liberalism. All true. This critical race theory comes from critical theory of Herbert Marcuse in the Frankfurt School in Nazi Germany, way back in the 1930s, I believe it was. And their critical theory was the basis for all these theories that came after it. And this is a Marxist theory. So yeah, it opposes liberalism. It does reject the concept of truth and merit. It rejects the concept of personal responsibility and transfers that responsibility onto the culture. Not just all parts of the culture, but the claim is that the culture is white supremacist. And therefore, white people are responsible for every single problem that they can dream up in their heads. So, here are two people who are responsible in the 1980s for popularizing the concept of critical race theory. They played a role in fleshing it out as well as distinguishing it from the original critical theory. But they popularized it starting in the 1980s. And what you will notice here, and when you look at the players involved in creating this critical race theory, or rather critical racist theology, is that they are law professors. These are law professors claiming that that our culture is white supremacist, and that white supremacists and that the influence of that culture is what causes all the problems for their cohort. They identify themselves as black people, and they are victims. Now, how is it that our culture, the major dominating force is white supremacy, and these two professors, both black, become law professors, celebrated law professors, highly paid law professors at prestigious law schools, who are celebrated for theorizing that white supremacy runs the culture? How is it that they were not pushed down by white supremacy? This undermines their entire theory. Their very existence undermines the entire theory that they push forth. Here she is here in a larger picture, and here's the other fellow here, Derek Albert Bell, an American law professor and civil rights activist. In 1971, he became the first tenured African-American professor of law at Harvard Law School. Not just any law school, Harvard Law School, where the white supremacists must have their core of power. The white supremacists put this fellow into Harvard Law School, and he thrived in that environment despite his claim that critical race theory, that our culture run by white supremacists, is causing all the problems that you see around you for minorities. Interesting theory, just happens to be totally full of crap. So let's look on here. Here he is in a a bigger picture. So let's get straight. This is just a little bit of background information. This does not flesh out all the details, obviously, of critical racist theology. But I'll have to say this. Only people who are purely, deeply racist can come up with critical racist theology in the first place. So I have every reason to believe that these two professors and the whole cohort of the people who promote this crap are racists. Pure, right to the core racists. Just like that fellow from yesterday who was demanding reparations, a dentist, also, in spite of critical race theory, got right to one of the top professions in the U.S. and very highly paid jobs, and he's busy out there calling people white bitches. He is the racist. He is the racist who's supported by these kinds of people here, and it's supported by critical racist theology. His thinking was encouraged on those lines by the ambient support for critical racist theology that exists throughout our culture. Critical race theory, all its proponents, all of the people benefiting off it, are the socially accepted racists of our day. History will not treat them kindly. Let's move on to some of the other articles that I think are influenced by this exact theory and these exact racists. Here in CNN, Oakland will give low-income families of color $500 per month, no strings attached. Not poor people, not people in need, but people of color only. Apparently, when you're a poor white person, you don't get hungry. If you're a poor white person, you don't have extra bills to pay. This is right along the lines of critical racist theology. This was just come out in the news 2 days ago in CNN. Let's have a look forward here. Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf announced this week that the city will launch a guaranteed income project to give hundreds of black and indigenous families and people of color $500 per month for 18 months. Now, this is the equivalent of putting a great big sign outside your city hall saying, "White people need not apply." This is what this sign says. This is exactly what it says here. Because read it there. Hundreds of black and indigenous families and people of color. In other words, I'm getting so used to this phraseology, it just doesn't even faze you anymore. But it is really a sign that says, white people not welcome, need not apply here. This is exactly in no uncertain terms. These are the racists of our day. Let's read on. The poverty we all witness today is not a personal failure, it is a system failure. This is exactly what critical racist theology has taught them. This is how they are rationalizing their racism today. It is a system failure. It is not your fault that you're not a dentist or a doctor or a brain surgeon or an astronaut. It's not your fault. The system failed you because that's obviously why you didn't get off your butt and work for your living. Guaranteed income is one of the most promising tools for systems change, they say. Racial equity and economic mobility we've seen in decades. Clearly, if you believe the critical racist theologists that white supremacy and white people have caused all the problems in the world, then yeah, you're going to let everybody off the hook. Only it's false. The evidence is all around us. I spent quite a lot of time in New York City years ago, and I met all kinds of very successful, very smart, very well-respected black people in New York City and New Jersey. And that's the same all around the United States. Whole families, all of whom are brothers and sisters, successful. How did that happen in a culture run by white supremacists? How does it happen? It doesn't, because the culture is not run by white supremacists. These are lying racists, and they are exerting an enormous influence on not just our culture, but the entire Western world, from Australia through Europe and through Britain. These are the socially accepted racists of our age. So let's move on. By focusing on BIPOC, that's one of their new acronyms for people of color and so on, the Oakland Resilient Families Program will provide critical financial support to those hardest hit by systemic inequalities, including the pandemic's disproportionate toll on communities of color. The disproportionate toll and those hardest hit are poor, and a lot of them are white. Are they not suffering? Not according to the racists. They don't deserve any help. This is the world the Western world has coming to. Racists are running it. The racists are racist against white people. And this is going to continue to get worse. Notice here, I just saw there, if we turn back a bit here, provide critical financial support. I think that's an unconscious use of the word critical. It's interesting that it comes from critical racist theology. These are critical racists. It's quite obvious. It's quite possible that it's just an accident, but struck me as a thought. In 2019, reading from the top, 100 residents in Stockton, California began receiving unconditional $500 payments. Other initiatives in Newark, New Jersey, and Atlanta, Georgia were launched as recently as 2020. And they're talking about these basic income supplements and experiments in universal basic income. The program is also opened to, this is very important, this really tips the hat of these leftist Democrats. The program is also open to undocumented and or unsheltered families. Because recipients will not be required to work for the payments, the money is not considered taxable income. But look at the top there. You can be a white, poor, suffering citizen of the United States, and you don't deserve a dime. Even though you may be making $40,000 a year living in this town, paying taxes to these people who tell you you don't matter and post signs that white people need not apply, they're going to give your tax dollars, even though your child may be needing new shoes and school books and whatnot and better food, they're going to give them to undocumented people. That means illegal immigrants. Illegal immigrants valued more by your tax dollars than you are. These are the racist bigots that are running our countries today. Let's move on. I think that's blocked on me again. Bear with me a second while I find the right spot. Nope, that was it for that particular article. The next one, and this is going to be a short session today. I didn't really come across all that many things that I captured to talk about. But you can see right there, it seems clear to me, and you can draw your own conclusions and let me know in the comments whether you think I'm off base on this. I think this stuff is all supported by critical racist theology of these racists that are in power today, these anti-white racists. Let's read this article from the Daily Mail, and I think this goes from Australia. Again, this came out just yesterday. Now, let's have a read. From the top. Outrage as young boys are forced to stand in school assembly and apologize for rapes committed by their gender to female classmates. Folks, if you're not outraged at the nonsense that these teachers, these educators are doing, they're all feminists. They're all man-hating feminists, especially in Australia. That's a very strongly feminist place. But now you have a feminist President of the United States of America. We have a feminist Prime Minister of Canada, and they are putting forth all of these same man-hating things right around the Western world. Seriously, we've got to get rid of these people. We shouldn't have any more tolerance for feminism in the West than the Germans should have had for Nazism in Germany in the 1930s, before World War II broke out. Germans should have kicked every last Nazi right to the curb. And we should be kicking every last bigoted, hate-filled, racist, and sexist feminist to the curb. So, let's move on. Reading from the top. One parent said her son in year 7 was left confused about why he had to stage the bizarre apology where boys were told to say sorry that women are raped and sexually assaulted. Look, nobody's going to argue that it isn't terrible that women get raped and sexually assaulted. It is terrible. But these are innocent boys. Why are they being browbeat for stuff they haven't done? It's no different than the boys standing up and demanding that every woman in there should apologize for the women in the world who have killed their own children. In fact, that's a bigger issue. Women are murdering their own children. In fact, 99% of infanticides, and they use the word infanticide to hide the fact that it's a sheer murder, and they give it a lighter sentence, because our culture is gynocentric and it excuse women's behavior on all kinds of issues. But why is it? How outraged would we all be if the school decided that all the women needed to stand up and apologize to the boys in the class for the women in the world who killed their own children? We know what would happen then. Wow, just wow. This is actually disgusting, Brower College. This is one of the parents responding. Not at all impressed that you made my son apologize for something he's never done nor considered doing. There's an old saying, treat someone badly and they will have a bad behavior outcome respond to you. They're treating boys like criminals for doing nothing wrong. The criminals here are the educators. They need to be all kicked out of their jobs. And in fact, it shouldn't be any different. The requirement of hiring a feminist should be equivalent of hiring a racist. Or hiring, a Nazi. Because feminism today is the equivalent of Nazism of 1930s and 40s Germany. Reading from the top. The assembly included the screening of a video message by Brisbane Boys College captain Mason Black about being proactive in stopping incidents of sexual assault and harassment, she said in a statement. This young fellow, he was virtue signaling to his school and primping and preening for all of this. And look, of course, sexual assault and harassment is not supported. Shouldn't be supported. I don't even think I should have to keep saying this, but we do have to, because if you defend yourself for the crap that they're pouring on men and boys in our culture, for sure the first thing they're going to say is that you support sexual assault and harassment of women. It happens every single time. And that's how they try to browbeat you and intimidate you into keeping your mouth shut and taking a beating like at these schools here, by accusing you of supporting sexual harassment or excusing sexual harassment and sexual assault. No, that's how they want to keep you silent and continue their abuse of men and boys in our culture. It's not going to work. As part of this discussion, boys were asked to stand as a symbolic gesture of apology for the behaviors of their gender and that have hurt or offended girls and women. Their whole gender. Never, ever, anywhere will you see anyone demanding that women apologize for their entire gender, nor should you. And every last one of us men here should tell them all where to go and how to do it and where to stick that stuff. If they try to make you or even imply that you are responsible for the behaviors of other men who misbehaved or committed crimes of various kinds. I'm no more responsible for sexual assault of any women in the world than I am responsible for the crash of the 2008 stock market or for the creation of Bitcoin. I didn't do it. So I'm not going to apologize for it. Jesus. Let's move on here. In retrospect, while well-intended, we recognize that this part of the assembly was inappropriate. This is the school principal speaking here, only because she got caught, only because she's held to the mat on it. But you can darn well bet that she'll go straight out there doing that and worse things until she gets caught again or kicked right out of power. But here, let's carry on with this article. You'll find all schools will be teaching consent over the next year. Brower won't be the only one. And here's the problem I have with this. They'll be teaching consent only to boys. They will be teaching girls that all the different ways that they can later call it rape. They'll be teaching girls all the different ways that they can play victim. They won't be teaching girls to seek consent from men. They won't be teaching girls that when you consent, you consent. That it's your responsibility. You can't then later regret it and charge that boy with rape. No, they'll be saying, yes, you've been coerced. They'll be teaching girls all the tricky little ways to pretend that it wasn't consent later. We've already seen this happening in the U.S. They're going to start this in high schools now, if they haven't already in many high schools. The assembly came just days after Wesley College in Melbourne was hit with claims some of its male students were ranking female students based on their looks. Big deal. Female students rank male students based on their looks, and worse. In fact, Facebook, one of the biggest companies in the world today, started entirely by people rating their fellow students on their looks. That's exactly the beginnings of Facebook, and it's pretty much the way human beings work. Look, grow up. The world isn't all filled with protective little cotton balls for you. You're going to be rated on all kinds of things in your life, and you're going to run across hardships. You're trying to protect these little girls like as if they're never going to grow past the emotional age of a 3-year-old. This is nonsense. The worst thing that we happen to say is to have a little conversation with the student body in an assembly saying, look, we appreciate everybody looks at beautiful people, but there's more to people than their looks. And have a discussion around that. And what are those things? But here is, they're going to roll out an entire program accusing boys of sexual assault and harassment, implying that on the basis and using these kinds of things that boys were rating girls on their looks. I mean, to be honest, folks, who on this planet would be surprised that boys are rating girls based on their looks? Who? I mean, what kind of an imbecile would you be to think that boys wouldn't do that? Or that girls wouldn't do that? This is another example of feminists taking normal human behavior, pathologizing it in order to browbeat boys and men. Rating. Is somebody's life destroyed because boys look at a girl and say, hey, she's an 8 or she's a 6 or whatever? It's going to happen whether you browbeat them to death or not. Anyways, read on. Multiple harassment and assault allegations have been leveled by students at the school. Victorian Acting Premier James Merlino has since moved to make teaching consent compulsory in all government schools from next month. I'm taking that this was on the basis of this well, no, I think there's a separate thing. There's harassment and assault allegations. These things are on the rise everywhere, not because harassment and assaults are on the rise, in my opinion, but because everything now is considered harassment and assault. If you say hello the wrong way, if you don't say hello, All of these things are harassment and assault today. The student body and everyone in our culture are being trained to be ultra sensitive and take everything to court, make a federal case out of everything you do. Lift up your little finger and you didn't lift it right, there's going to be a charge on it. Let's carry on. And that's not to say that some legitimate harassments and assault don't happen. They do. Women and men both get harassed and sexually assaulted and physically assaulted. All kinds of stuff like that. But this widening of the umbrella of the net to capture everything under the sun as sexual assault and harassment is actually making real legitimate cases seem less important. They're all lumped into one category. So you're doing a great disservice to true victims because you're feeding all this attention to narcissists. Narcissists and people working the system for attention. Mason Black stood in front of his peers last Thursday and told them he feels sick about the claims of sexual assault and that the narrative needs to change. And here he is with his mother. And this, I'm of two minds on this. Yeah, I don't support the sexual assault, obviously, or harassment and allegations or bullying or any of that stuff. But when we start to bully boys, blame them for stuff they didn't do, make them apologize to little girls, prohibit them from benefiting from programs based on their being a boy, the messages we are sending to little boys and young men constantly is that they're not worth anything. And then you're going to get up there and you're going to treat every inconvenient little social interaction as a sexual assault or as a harassment. You're kind of losing my interest. You'll gain my interest again when you treat boys with the same sensitivity and care that you treat girls. And I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime. So let's carry on here. And this article comes from A Voice for Men. And this lady wrote this article about when her own son decided that he was a girl. It's worth reading. I don't have, obviously I didn't quote the whole article here. It's not terribly long, but it's quite a lot longer than I'm going to quote here. But there's a couple of good points she makes in this. And I don't know if this is really related to critical race theory, but this is another issue which I think was worth talking about. Let's read from the top. As soon as he started high school, he stopped hanging out with his friend group from middle school and would not tell us why. That was when he started to withdraw. Entering in high school, there's a big red flag there because, as we just saw, boys are treated like criminals right out of the gate in high school. To some degree, they're being treated like that in grade school too. I should have quoted this or captured some shots from this other article where they're telling parents to start that your children, oh no, I did talk about this yesterday. Children as young as 3 months old are racist. Of course, they're only going to be referring to boys. Then came the announcement. He said he was really a girl. He wanted to take puberty blockers and estrogen immediately. The link, of course, is in the description as usual. Let's read on. It didn't take long to answer that question. The question is that what had changed in this boy's life. As soon as we got to the gender clinic we were referred to, I realized that the kids in my son's generation are being pushed into thinking of themselves as transgender, even if there's no basis to it at all. I thought that they would assess him and talk him out of it, but it was a one-way street. Look, you guys know as well as I do that in our culture, everything a man does is considered, the only thing considered masculine is toxic behavior. And they have a term for it. They call it toxic masculinity. Another crap term meant to slur all men. The corollary or the suggestion in this kind of approach to gender gender separation of behaviors is that therefore all good behaviors, all praiseworthy behaviors, all productive behaviors are female. Young men, confused young men, faced 24/7 with this environment in school, in online, in the media, what are they going to start to think? They're going to be thinking to themselves, I'm a good person. All the programs for getting ahead are giving to women, math advancements and how to get into special programs and special help for this, special help for that, all positive stuff are only available for women in most of these schools. And these guys who want to build something with their lives and see themselves as a positive, they're going to say, well, I'm not toxic. I'm not all that. I don't harass people. I must be a woman. Let's read what this woman has to say. This is the mother of that son. As soon as a boy says he thinks he's a girl, he's on the path to transition. This is quite true and quite alarming. There's no criticizing of him. Of course, any doctor or therapist that starts to question the boy's decision that he's actually a girl is likely to lose their license and their job and their livelihood. That's the insanity point we're at right now. It wasn't just the clinic, read with me from the top, says this mother. The more I looked into it, the more I learned that his school was obsessed with talking about gender. Surprise, surprise, there's no surprise there for us. And celebrating boys who say that they're girls, even though they're clearly not. So the entire social environment around these young developing boys is pushing them towards thinking of themselves as not toxic male. And if I'm not toxic male, if I'm not toxic, I must not be male. That's the message they're getting. As soon as a kid comes out as trans, there's nothing but affirmation. They get attention. They're told how brave they are. No one ever questions the absurdity of it. These children are teenagers or even younger. We're sitting here in our culture developing a major, major problem. It's sick. It's beyond sick. This needs drastic, drastic treatment. We need to kick every last educator out who is supporting this kind of feminist nonsense. All it took, reading from the top, was a Google search, and he was surrounded by voices telling him he was really a girl. None of them had even met him. This is exactly what's going on. These people never even met the fellow, and this is what a young boy will find, and they spend a lot of their life online. None of them that even met him, telling him that he's really a girl. And where are these ideas coming from? The unmoored, crazy feminists with their crazy theology. Reading from the top. A couple of years later, I now understand what got my son to this place. Puberty made him uncomfortable with his body. That's not terribly surprising, and I think that's quite common. But it wasn't just that. It was that he was such a smart, nerdy kid. And boys who are nerdy, even if they're masculine, are told every day that they might actually be girls. That is true. Reading on. Everything has changed. If you're not G.I. Joe, you're in trouble. These boys don't understand that there are all types of men. They think that if they are not the stereotypical male, then they're not male at all. This is very true. Being male has nothing to do with being a macho. Has nothing to do with being prowess in sports. It doesn't have anything to do with your preferences in television shows or whether you like to read. You can be male and you do all of those things. But this is not the message that young boys are given. There are thousands of different kinds of men that I've met in my life. In gay men, there's poets, musicians, artists, sports guys, scientists, athletes. They're all male. But the message today does suggest that there's really only one or very limited range of maleness. And so these young boys in that confusing part of their lives are deciding, well, if that's what being a male is, maybe I'm not a male. And then immediately they're surrounded with this influence in the social sphere, both online and in school and everywhere in our culture. They're praised for it with attention. And so they get convinced, well, I'm not a male because I don't fit into that tiny little category that these racist bigots, sexists, are calling male today. About the only kind of masculinity that feminists admits is out there is toxic masculinity. Feminism is a bigoted, hateful, theological movement. It needs to be rejected in its entirety. And those pushing this crap need to be held accountable for it. Reading from the top. What my son is trying to do is opt out of manhood. This is really quite right. He doesn't really want to be a woman. He just can't see himself as a man in this world, and I can't blame him. All of the messages from our media, in our education system, from their absence of programs for men and boys, the exclusion of boys from programs, and the elevation beyond belief of everything female, and the celebration of everything female, what person would really want to go through that in life? A person who thinks of themselves, they think of themselves as a sensitive person. I was a sensitive young boy myself. And yeah, it was difficult in some of the points of my life dealing with, the rough and tumble of men and masculinity. I did find that difficult at times. And there were times where I wanted away from it. But this is what this woman said here is worth reading a second time. What my son is trying to do is opt out of manhood. He doesn't really want to be a woman. This is such an important distinction. He is possibly afraid of what he sees the man's world has in store for him. Not that he wants to be a woman, but he doesn't see himself in a man's world. Not because the man's world is what feminists say it is. No. Men's world is... Feminists know absolutely nothing about men. This is the conclusion I've come to over the years. There's this old saying, oh, well, men don't understand women, and the implication being that women understand men, but it's absolutely the opposite. Feminists don't understand the first thing about masculinity. I've had many different, been part of many different men's groups, both in workplaces and outside the workplaces and sports, and I can tell you, as probably most of you guys can, there's good and bad in there. There can be bullying at times, but that's not the norm. Most men, even in competition, they help one another up. They try to help you develop your skills. They coach each other. Feminists know nothing about masculinity, and they're scaring and distorting the view of manhood onto young impressionable boys. They've created an intensely toxic environment in the education system for boys and men. Feminists are the problem. Let's read the last quote here from this young mother, this mother, I don't know what age she is, who wrote the article on a Voice for Men's website, and you can see the link in the description. When I was growing up, read from the top with me, boys had role models who were smart and creative, architects, engineers, and lawyers. Nowadays, gender activists go into schools and tell young men they can be either sex. That's not all they're saying, but it's a good point. They're also telling young men that men are toxic. Men need to apologize for the horrible things that their gender has done to women and is doing to women. They're eliminating all boys' programs. They have to be made open to girls. And they're creating plethora of women-only programs, girls-only programs. The clear message is that boys are not really welcome. Masculinity is toxic. And then they turn around with this, and the same hand say that, but you can change your gender. You don't have to be male. You can call yourself female, and like waving a magic wand, all of those problems go away, and you have 100% access to the almost infinite amount of support and programs that every girl deserves. That's what that woman's son was facing in high school. And with that, folks, that's all I've got to say on the topic for today. Thank you so much for joining me on Coffee with Steve. And I'll try to get back. I'll try to be back this weekend, if not early next week. This is the final stage of my move to a new apartment, and so I'm going to be fairly busy over the next few days and moving everything over there and getting set up. So have a good weekend, and like I like to remind people every session, do something you love today. Do something you love to do every single day. And if you don't have something you love to do, find something you love to do. To me, this has been a lifesaver approach to my life. Every day, no matter how bad you think things are, find some way, do something you love to do. So with that, thanks again for joining me on Coffee with Steve, and I hope to see you again very, very soon.